Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events. And what a eventful week the past week has been. Actually, the past 2 weeks since the new year began have been full of tumult and exciting, unprecedented developments all over the globe. We shall cover them one by one, beginning from the neighborhood. I think there were developments in the neighborhood in Myanmar which were a little problematic for India, because ever since the military junta almost a year back took over power, imprisoned Aung San Suu Kyi, accused her of various crimes, came down with the brutal suppression of protest movements against the second coup, they have been treated as pariahs by the rest of the world, and including their immediate neighbors in ASEAN. But what happened in the beginning of the new year was that the Indian Foreign Secretary, Mr. Shringla, undertook a tour of Myanmar. This was not to accord legitimacy to the military junta, but to explore the possibilities of preserving Indian interest in that country. Then there was a visit by the current chair of ASEAN, of Cambodia, who went on a visit to Myanmar, and his argument was that he wanted to engage the junta, engage the country, not keep it ostracized. But this aroused eyebrows all over the place, because ASEAN has been trying to isolate and distance itself from the military junta in Myanmar. So this was, Hun Sen kept claiming that this was a personal visit, but he was, as a current chair, representing some gravitas to his visit, and so this happened to be a bit of a problematic. So India has had to cope with this challenge of how to deal with Myanmar realpolitically, or try to follow the trend which the rest of the world was doing. Now, the interesting part about this Myanmar problem is that the government of India has been made to realize that it has very limited leverage with the government, the present government, the military junta in Myanmar, and it has very vital interests involved there. When the Foreign Secretary came back, he also indicated that the People's Liberation Army in Manipur that had targeted and assassinated commandant of an Indian Army, Assam Rifles deployed in that area, along with his family, probably were closely linked with the military junta. Now, the argument is that the military junta is looking for all help, all able-bodied people who could be trained into counter-insurgency warfare, because it is confronted with almost an armed hostile challenge in the periphery, whether it's the Karen's and the Shans towards the north or the southern part of the country. So they have been recruiting these insurgents, providing them refuge and shelter to unleash them against the opponents of the regime. But then, as long as these insurgents also have been targeting Indian sensitive targets in India, the Indians have to remain concerned about that. At the same time, the junta tried to show its goodwill by handing over to the government of India 5 Manipuri insurgents, but that is more or less under pressure or to show a sign of goodwill. How long can India expect this to continue is something which is very, very difficult to calculate at this stage. Also, at the same time, the government of India has had to cope with the problem that it is under pressure. No government has recognized the Taliban regime in Kabul till present, but they've been putting pressure through a variety of means that one day every country has to deal with Talibans, because they are in control of a very, very sensitive geopolitical country in Afghanistan. So the same logic applies to Myanmar. Myanmar might not be a landlocked country. Myanmar not at the moment be as significant for American geopolitical considerations as Afghanistan continues to remain. For India also, one might say that it is not as complicated as Af-Pak hyphenated relationship and the relationship, but Myanmar is next door, and Myanmar impacts on our relationship with Bangladesh thanks to the Rohingya crisis, and also because of insurgency and instability in the northeast, which unfortunately in the past, either due to the CAA or due to our deteriorating relationship with Bangladesh because of some irresponsible statements made by senior leaders, has continued. So this was something which India will have to tread with caution and decide how it is going to deal with the current regime in power in Myanmar, Naypyidaw, And the Tatmadaw, the army which seems to represent the will of the people and is supported to a large extent by some conservative elements in the Buddhist Sangha also. So it doesn't seem to be threatened immediately. It is not going to implode or disintegrate as long as the Chinese give it support, as long as different countries, even in ASEAN, try to look after their interest there. So there have been news items of mines collapsing, bonded labor dying, and all these have a close nexus with the contraband trade which the country has with China. And this contraband trade would not have continued had China not wanted it to continue. So this remains a challenge on our eastern periphery, which India will have to watch carefully. But the events that kept the international analysts riveted were the developments in Kazakhstan. And what happened in Kazakhstan was something not totally unexpected to the experts, but more or less the timing was such that it caught the world by surprise. People had been thinking that the feudal democracy that operates in Kazakhstan, the largest of the erstwhile republics which were part of the Soviet Union, the largest country in the Central Asia among the republicans, it at one time before the disintegration and dissolution of the Soviet Empire occupied almost 12% of the total territory landmass, Eurasian landmass of the Russia. So I think it's a country which is very big. It is a country which is not totally landlocked like most other countries in Central Asia. It does open out into the Caspian Inland Sea. But what is more important is Kazakhstan, when Soviet Union disintegrated, had the fourth largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. It had at one time accused the Soviet Union of using Kazakhstan as a dumping ground for nuclear tests, nuclear waste. The nuclear tests were done, more than 400 nuclear tests were done underground and overground, and exposing the local population. Although the population density is very thin in Kazakhstan, but even in the sparsely populated country, the threat of diseases triggered by radiation was very, very great. So this was the kind of a tension between Kazakhstan and the Soviet Union during the best of the days. The interesting part is this: the Kazakhs were not always the part of Soviet Union. They only joined Soviet Union as a republic in the 1930s. Before that, in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, there were random attacks by Kazakhs on the Russian imperial domains, and the Russians used to fight them, subdue them. The fortunes of the war fluctuated in this remote hinterland. But since 30s still, and we should not forget that Kazakhstan was the last Central Asian Republic to opt out of Russia. So there was a relationship which was not without irritants and tension, but there was a relationship where, let's say, the leader who ruled Kazakhstan with an iron hand after the decline of Soviet Union and emergence of the more weakened Russia, Nursultan Nazarbayev, ruled for 30 years as a hardcore communist leader who had come up during the pre-Mikhail Gorbachev era, slowly climbing up the ladders in his country. Let's also not forget that during this period when Kazakhstan remained a part of the Soviet Union, was an important republic there, it also was developed. The infrastructure was developed, and it was admittedly lopsided. There was uneven regional development. Only the cities were developed. Only the infrastructure where the Russians were interested was developed. Bakainur, the cosmodrome, is the one where from even today the Russian space stations continued to be launched. This was the place where from the Indian astronauts were launched into their orbit into space. And the development of the capital, Astana, which is now called Nur Sultan at the moment, honoring Nazarbayev, the former president, and also Almaty, the largest city in the country, where the infrastructural development was restricted to. The rest of the country felt neglected and probably had reasonable grievances in terms of social inequality, in terms of modernity bypassing them, lack of employment facilities, lack of even a couple of years back, more than a couple of years back, perhaps a decade back, there was unrest in the oil-producing, gas-producing regions of Kazakhstan, where labor had risen in revolt and the workers had been brutally suppressed. So this time, coincidentally, some people thought that it was commemorating the anniversary of that brutal suppression which triggered off these protest movements against the present regime. But there are more interesting aspects to this. Even today, when you look at the democratic profile of Kazakhstan, almost 20% of the population is of Russian origin. And the Kazakhs are just a little over 67-68% of the total population. The rest are other nationalities, from Korean to Japanese to Chinese to Tajiks to other Central Asian republics that are neighbors to Kazakhstan. But the interesting part, the most interesting part which makes Kazakhstan so volatile is that it is not only the size, it is in the list of the first 10 largest countries geographically in the world. It also almost comprises the geographical landmass comprising all of Europe. But more interesting is the ownership of the extremely valuable strategic resources it has. It is the largest stores of chrome. It has second or third largest stores of uranium. It has copper. It has iron ore. It has it has gas and petroleum. So it is, and also it is geopolitically situated between two large neighbors, Russia and China, and it is not like a small landlocked neighbor between two giants. It is a large enough a country. Now, the other interesting part is that although the majority of the population of Kazakhstan professes Islam, Islam in the Central Asian republics is very different from the aggressive, fundamentalist, dogmatic Islam that seems to be threatening the Western civilization and some peace and tranquility in other countries. So it is not a confrontationist Islam that has been practiced traditionally in Kazakhstan. But Kazakhstan also is a country of nomads. It is a country which is basically ruled by community elders, by tribal chiefs, and they have practiced a kind of a consensual community at the grassroots levels, which is very different from elected democracy, which has been imposed. And the elected democracy imposed from top post the Soviet worldview has been what has been creating a problem. So Nur Sultan Nazarbayev retired and handed over power to his nominated handpicked successor, Tokayev, Kasim Tokayev, who is the present president, and retired to the background. But he did not retire entirely. He continued to enjoy high-sounding honorific titles. He was supervising the security. His family had amassed great wealth, which they were continuing to multiply, and they were provided some kind of an immunity. Part of the ill will against Nazarbayev was transparent during the recent protest movements, where the slogans were shouted, "Get out, old man! Get out, old man!" The old man being Nazarbayev. Now, the interesting part is this, that the successor himself is no spring chicken. He is close to 78 years old, and he was hoping to have a diarchy kind of sort, share power with the people, handpicked people of Nazarbayev and his own people. And some people have viewed the happenings in Kazakhstan as a power struggle between Tokayev and Nazarbayev and his people, because Nazarbayev has been stripped of his high-sounding titles. His family continues to remain protected in the country. But the point is that the people whom he trusted and had appointed had been removed, including the security chief, who has been charged with high treason, has been arrested, and Tokayev has put his people there. But there are other interesting developments which have been raising eyebrows elsewhere. When Tokayev failed to suppress protest movements in Almaty, and the protesters, peaceful to begin with, became a little violent a little over. and they captured certain government buildings, including one of the palaces of the president, and they seemed to threaten peace and tranquility. So Tokayev first of all said that I have given order to my troops to shoot at sight and to kill and to exterminate these protesters, whom he charged as bandits and terrorists who are being provoked and egged on by foreigners. He did not name who the foreigners were, but he just made these allegations and said that I have decided that they should be eliminated and shoot to kill orders were given. Even these did not restore peace, and Tokayev had to make a long phone call to Putin and get assurance that there would be the Collective Security Organization Treaty. Now, this was a treaty signed way back in 90s, where Belarus is there, Georgia is there, Moldova is there, and of course, Russia is there in the background, to come to the aid if there was a country, an erstwhile Commonwealth of Republics, was attacked by any country. Now, in this case, there was no attack from an external enemy. There was an internal instability. Emergency had to be declared. But what happened is that some 3,500 troops under the banner of Collective Security Organization Treaty were sent to Kazakhstan to quell the disturbances. They managed to do so, and in reasonable time. In addition, Russians had sent 1,500 plus paratroopers not to immediately confront the protesters, but to protect strategically sensitive buildings, etc. Now, the analysts in the Western world were quick to point out that what business did Russia have to interfere or intervene in the affairs of a sovereign country, although it is next door. Now, it is not only next door, it shares a land border of more than 4,600 miles with Russia. It shares a fairly long border with China also. So, I mean, a country which is adjacent to you and is full of this turmoil, on the verge of collapse, cannot be, you can't shut your eyes to that. Now, the argument from the Russian side was that why should the Americans or the Western world object to any intervention when they themselves have been intervening almost unilaterally from Iraq to Syria to Afghanistan to Libya, anywhere they want to have a regime change, they intervene, and they have a facade of multinational intervention. They don't wait for the United Nations collective security provisions like the NATO is used or a multinational alliance is deployed and say it is multilateral intervention. In Russia's case also, they said that CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, was exactly a collective security mechanism which was triggered this time where it happened. So obviously the double standards of the Americans in the Western world were exposed. Now, the question which comes is, the American analysts kept saying that the Russians, once they get into somebody's house like they did in Belarus, they never move out, and this is what is going to happen to Kazakhstan. These Cassandras have been proved wrong. The Russian troops and the CSTO troops have already started their withdrawal from Kazakhstan back to their original places where they had come from. Now, interestingly, some analysts speculate that isn't this a gamble which Putin is likely to lose? He is already in a siege kind of a situation, stalemate kind of a situation with the Western world about Ukraine, his intervention in Ukraine, his likely invasion of Ukraine, his amassing of more than 100,000 troops in Ukraine. And why should he open another front on the east where he is vulnerable? But then again, some other analysts are of the opinion that he had no option. And once he proves his might or his mental will to intervene in an area which he thinks is of sensitive vital interest to Kazakhstan, Ukraine is far more sensitive to the identity of Russia and its security interests. So probably intervening in Kazakhstan is signaling to the West that better watch out in Ukraine. So this is what we have to keep in mind. What does India do about this? India doesn't have very substantial economic interest in Kazakhstan. Obviously, India during the Soviet days had always talked in terms of mineral resources which could be extracted from Kazakhstan and brought to India, gas, petroleum, rare earth, rare metals, etc. And also India was in a position to, perhaps in animal husbandry, in intermediate technology, in Medicare, in education, to help out Kazakhstan in development of community development programs or planning. But this, of course, is all past. Post-Afghanistan, India doesn't have a direct access to Kazakhstan. So although in past prime ministers like Narsingh Rao, like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, like Dr. Manmohan Singh, and now more recently Mr. Modi have visited Kazakhstan, this is to signify that we have an interest in the region, particularly because of China, because the other border of Kazakhstan, thousands of kilometers long, is shared with China. So we definitely don't want China to have the exclusive presence in Kazakhstan. And as far as the Russia and China are concerned, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization primarily was to jointly manage the Central Asian Republic. And in this SCO, India first started as an observer, then as a member. I think the problem is to accommodate India nominally, but India has very limited capacity to influence developments in Central Asia, particularly post-Afghanistan. It is a hard, core realistic admission that there are limits to what we can do in Kazakhstan. It is not very often that one encounters a very heartening development which was not expected in international relations, which holds hope for future, not only for the country where the developments are taking place, but as a beacon for others to follow as well. And this is exactly what we witnessed in Chile during the past weeks. There was speculation that there was a neck-to-neck fight between the two contestants. One erstwhile student leader, a leftist, a young person in his 40s, and then a very conservative, ultra-conservative leader who was harking back to the days of and the legacy of the dictator Pinochet. But as it turned out, in the runoff, the young leftist student leader, Garcia, very easily defeated the conservative rival by a 12 percentage point difference. And the moment he came into power, he tried to redeem his election promises to have a new constituent assembly for the constitution. And till date, Chile had been ruled by a constitution which had been put in place in the days of Pinochet, the notorious dictator. So there was a demand that it was not representative, it was not having enough space for indigenous people, it had no provision to control the exploitation by a corrupt dictatorial regime of the natural resources of the country, or to tie up against the people's wishes to the United States of America, the big brother to the north. But before we come to that, we must quickly recapitulate what the problem of Chile has been. In 1971, Chile voted for a leftist president called Allende. And this was not liked by the Americans at all, because the big American businesses, the corporations which were exploiting copper and timber resources in next door Brazil, they had interest in Chile. They wanted to have ownership of all the economic resources of this country. So Henry Kissinger, who was then the Secretary of State, came out with a statement that the voters of Chile had voted irresponsibly. Now, had the USA remained confined to comments, it would have been perhaps acceptable. But they went far beyond commenting adversely. They engineered a coup against Allende, who finally was killed, and a dictator was imposed, which was Pinochet, who ruled for decades, and he suppressed his opponents very brutally. There were lots of midnight arrests from the house. People disappeared from their house. Until this date, there has been no closure that how many thousands of people, the young people, were killed by this brutal regime. So there was no question of going back to a period of the legacy of Pinochet, or saying that he provided stability, he provided some economic development. And the new president, who's now going to soon assume office, made a promise that it is not necessary to mortgage your economic resources to Americans or multinational corporations to have an equitous economy in the country. So this hope, the younger generation in Chile has bought the promises made by the new president, and the new president has acted swiftly to appoint a leading epidemiologist, another 40-year-old young scientist, as the president of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly has been given a time limit of 9 months to come out with a new constitution, with an extension possibly of 3 months. The president has promised to respect the autonomy of the Constituent Assembly, but to work in cooperation with that. So now what is happening is that the issues which are in the forefront of the Chilean politics are environmental protection, social equity, sovereign control over its own natural resources, trying to get rid of the regionally imbalanced development, and also to provide place of the indigenous people in the national fabric of national polity, economy, and society. Now, all these five are what will we say the rainbow promises of a green agenda, which a country is committing itself to, and all of us can only wish well to the experiment which is taking place in Chile. Chile also is experimenting with constitutional structure, like how a federal constitution should actually work at. So there is an extremely interesting debate which is taking place between political scientists, that there was a time when United States of America destroyed the democratic embryos of democratic development in 1970s in Chile, and it has come to a full circle after half a century when Chile is providing lessons for badly ailing American democracy to learn something and temper its democratic misbehavior, quote unquote, the freedoms, abuse of liberties, racial discrimination, filibusters, abuse of the federal system. Now, all that is interesting because India also is a federal polity. India also has been in recent past facing charges of erosion of democratic institutions. So what Chile is doing is embarking on a path of extremely adventurous constitution making and trying to regain control of its polity and ultimately share power, not only political but economic power, more or less evenly. Now, this may appear as a utopian dream to some, but there are other movements, like in Germany, emergence of the Green Party after Angela Merkel's departure from the scene, where again there have been movements towards green energy, more open attitude towards immigrants, and also at the same time trying to regain autonomy of the country's polity and not being committed blindly to an alliance system or a larger group of nations. So how it will unfold, we'll have to watch and see. Again, Chile is a very, very distant country. India has limited ties. India has been concentrating more on the BRICS and the IPSA with Brazil. Brazil is at the moment engrossed in troubles of its own. But if Chile manages to progress on this path evenly for a short while, one has hope that even Brazil will probably be correcting course. And of course, there have been issues in next door Argentina about the banning of abortions, the protest movements against that. So in all these countries, you also have a problem of the legacy of the church, which might be the Catholic Church, dating back to when these countries were colonies of Spain or Portugal. But at the same time, there has been the legacy of church here of theological liberation theology also. So it is a very, very mixed kind of a legacy inheritance which these countries have. And Chile, everybody is looking towards with great hope. Another development which was of concern was the talks between Russia and America. The immediate context was the looming crisis in Ukraine, because Russians have had in the past months deployed more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian eastern border. Ukrainians are very worried that not only are the Russians doing salami slicing, the Russians have already deployed a whole lot of agent provocateurs of Russian-speaking, Russian origin, who would always raise the flag and say that they want to join the eastern, Ukraine wants to join Russia, and this would lead on to some kind of violence when the Ukrainians want to protect their territorial integrity and sovereignty. Then the Russians would be under the pretext of saving these people of Slav origin, Russian speakers, wanting to reunite with Russia, intervene. Now, interestingly, what happened was that Putin made it very clear that he was willing to negotiate with the West about diffusing of the Ukrainian crisis. So two sets of talks took place in the past weeks. One was Putin talking to Biden virtually, the Russian foreign ministers, deputy foreign ministers talking to their counterparts digitally and also personally. There were talks in Geneva between the foreign ministers, deputy foreign ministers, the statesmen, the diplomats, and there were talks in Brussels, in Belgium, between the NATO generals and the generals on the Russian side. Now, interestingly, although the willingness to negotiate was expressed by Putin, but the kind of offers which he made were more ultimatums than offers. They were sort of proposals which the West had no option but to refuse out of hand. He would say that NATO should close its doors to future members. So Ukraine, which was wanting to become a member, or the Baltic states, of course the Russians can't do much about it, but the Scandinavian countries who have been waiting to reluctantly at times to join NATO or otherwise should not do. NATO has always said that it is an open-ended membership club, and if a country wants to join it, they are not going to exclude the country if it conforms to the norms of whatever the charters of NATO are. Also, the Russians made it very clear, Putin was very belligerent. He said that if there are more economic sanctions against the Russians, institutions or individuals, including President Putin himself, then the West should be prepared for retaliation, which might be much worse than they have encountered so far. Now, this is an extremely interesting situation in these two talks. You see, the Geneva talks between the diplomats and the statesmen and the military people in Brussels are at two parallel tracks. So the Geneva talks kept out the Europeans of the loop. They were criticized. The French and the Germans were not too happy about that. They did not come out with very bitter criticism, but they did feel a bit left out, that their fate was being decided, where NATO troops would be deployed in Poland or Hungary or Bulgaria or Romania, what was going to happen. It had a direct bearing on their future. On one hand, the US was expecting them to turn the screws on Putin, not say no to the Nord Stream gas purchases. At the second, they were not being informed what the talks with Putin were going to be. So the Americans were apparently looking after their interests, their strategic global interests, rather than the security of Europe. That was one argument. Of course, when the NATO talks took place in Brussels, then the argument was that because all the European countries, mostly of EU, were members of NATO, so they were in the loop, they were kept in the loop between the NATO talks and the talks with the Russian generals. But the state is rather interesting, state of the game, state of the play is rather interesting. Both the Russians and the Americans have admitted that no progress has been made and there no likely progress is to be made in the talks in Geneva. What is happening in NATO is not totally unrelated to what happens, progress made or lack of it in Geneva. So at one level, these two are linked. And also what complicates matters is that Macron is going to face elections in a couple of months' time. And Germany is still trying to stabilize its polity and economy and foreign policy in a coalition government with Greens after the departure of Angela Merkel. So Europe is in a bit of a disarray. There is no unanimity about how to cope with either Russia or with China. And when this confrontation takes place in Ukraine, these talks take place, there is little the Europeans can do. And also, unfortunately, ever since the Brexit, an ongoing strain on European unity has been how to respond to the reckless behavior of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who commits himself to one program one day, goes back on his word the other day, then he wants an extension. So this is likely to continue. Now, one speculation is that some strategic analysts believe that when the weather improves a little, in the month of February, the Russians will show their hand and either intervene directly or hold on for a little more time. There is not much which Indians can do in this case also, because India depends to a very large extent for its military hardware purchases on Russia. It needs Russia to put some kind of a pressure, cushion the pressure which China is inflicting on India by building up villages in Arunachal, trying to barge its way in Bhutan. And of course, at the moment, the South China Sea doesn't seem to be on the boil, but any moment the Chinese can do it in Taiwan, Chinese can put pressure on Japan, and the North Koreans, who are a protege of China, have been testing their missiles oblivious of what the West wants them to do or not do. So these talks will probably continue, like the talks which US is having with Tehran on its nuclear program, and in coming months we shall have occasions to visit the progress of these talks many a time. There are times in international relations when a nation faces a crisis because a leader has miscalculated about a strategic challenge faced by the country. There are other times when the crisis is imposed on a country because of no fault of its leaders or its population, but there are ambitious neighbors next door or great powers which want to intervene. But there are ridiculous circumstances where the suicidal streak of some leaders embarrasses a country no end. And this is exactly what is happening to United Kingdom, the Great Britain as it is called at other times. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is known to be reckless, party-going type. He has been economical with truth. His opponents call him an outright liar. He has lied to the Parliament. He has lied to the Queen. And the lowest depths were reached recently when a disclosure was made that when the Queen was mourning for her consort, all solitary in a church, her Prime Minister was partying away in an orgiastic manner in number 10 Downing Street. And this is not the first time this party has been there. Earlier also there have been examples that the ruling elite of Britain, especially the leaders of the Conservative Party, think themselves above the law, and they prescribe a law for the people, but quite flout it and enjoy themselves. Now this time, unfortunately, it has been just the last straw on the back of the camel, so to speak. Boris Johnson has been caught, as the phrase has it, with the pants down, and people have said that, look, why are you trying to find scapegoats? He has sent two apologies. One apology to the Queen through his office, that he regrets that a lapse of this kind took place when she was in the mourning, the nation was in the mourning, the eve before Prince Philip's funeral, state funeral. The other person who has done so is a lower level, middle level aide, has accepted the mistake of having misjudgment and having bad judgment and sending out invitation for this party. But Boris Johnson's behavior seems to be almost unrepentant. He has said that he did not realize that he was participating in a party in which more than 100 people were invited, and in the lawns of the 10 Downing Street, everybody was indulging in alcohol. He thought it was a work appointment. So if this is the work appointment for the British Prime Minister, then why should anybody not have work ethic like him down the line also? Now, this combined thing, it is not only that his opponents are criticizing him, it is not only the people who have lost their dear and near one during COVID, who did not get one last opportunity to hold their hand or to see their face or to participate in the funeral, are objecting that why should there have been this kind of a discriminatory implementation of laws, one for the rulers, one for the ruled. Within the Conservative Party, there is a very simmering discontent, and they think that the Prime Minister is a liability, he is an albatross around their neck, and there are speculation that 15% members of the Conservative Party might get together and pass a resolution for a change of leadership. That would be the end of Boris Johnson. And Britain would probably be greatly relieved of a buffoon for a Prime Minister who did not make a distinction between his role as a journalist who was always exaggerating truth, faking stories to get a journalistic career on the go. And then he had promised to deliver the Brexit. Brexit was delivered under his charge, but then the promises made that the Brexit would be painless did not come true. And he's been prevaricating all along the time, at times trying to extend, at times trying to renegotiate the Brexit deal. This might be imposing a cost on his country, not only on his party, which would be too great. But what does the world do in situations like this? It is primarily the responsibility of the citizen, the electorate of the United Kingdom, to either keep him in office or get rid of him. I think he has gotten away with literally what is called in phrases a murder, literally with murder, in the sense that he does not seem to stick to a policy, goes back on his word, and always the explanation is that he misunderstood it. He thought this was not what it was. So I think this time it has gone too much. It is not only the question of the British Prime Minister offending the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen. It is not only acting in very bad taste. It is a chronic serial misconduct. And also there have been charges of corruption, of insider dealings to give contracts to people who contribute towards the refurbishment of the 10 Downing Street. And right now, the British Prime Minister is avoiding facing the cameras by saying that his family members have contracted COVID, so he is self-isolating himself. But how long can he self-isolate himself like this? A matter of 5 or 6 days, then this scandal is going to explode in his face. But as we said, this is a problem which the electorate in United Kingdom and Great Britain will have to live with. This is what the problem with Scotland and others, Ireland, which are affected by his misjudgment on Brexit, have to live with. I don't think that he will have any sympathy, he will have any support even within his party very soon. And this is all we have for you this week. Till we meet next week with another set of issues, another set of incidents, another analysis. We expect you to think about these problems in Kazakhstan, problems in Ukraine, the dialogue between United States and Russia, European Union in disarray, the very great problem of India maintaining a tightrope balance dealing with next door neighbor Myanmar, what it is going to lead to, and also what ridiculous situation Boris Johnson has landed his country into. But as we said, the glimmer of hope, the promise in Chile seems to be the bright ray in a very dark cloud. So till we meet again, thank you and goodbye.